The late morning sun poured over Maple and Mint Cafe, a corner place with white brick, a fringe of ivy, and a painted chalkboard announcing lemon tarts and cold brew. Customers drifted in and out between potted ficus and umbrella tables, while the lazy hush of weekday chatter blurred into the street's soft hum. And at one table, a man with the careful posture of someone who wakes early to beat the day sat with both hands wrapped around a steaming mug as if it could anchor him to the present. His name was Ethan Cole, 34, clean-shaven, with a sharp jaw softened by a day's weariness, dark hair combed neatly, though a rogue curl defied him at the temple, hazel eyes that cataloged exits and edges out of habit, the residual discipline of an ex-paramedic whose shoulders, broad but subtly stooped, remembered the weight of stretchers and the heavy, unspoken aftermath of sirens. And he wore a slate Oxford shirt rolled to the forearms, denim with faded knees, and a pair of boots scuffed just enough to suggest miles of sidewalks walked alone. What he did not love, what he could not quite forgive, were dogs. Not since a night 3 years ago, when a call had ended in a foyer, sprinkled with shattered glass, and a panicked shepherd lunging, and a child's breath caught in the wrong rhythm. And though the dog had only barked, the moment had welded itself to Ethan's reflexes. So when a brindle-coated mixed shepherd trotted close to his table now, ribcage, lean but strong, fur a tapestry of russet and coal, with a faint white blaze on the chest, amber eyes quick with calculation and concern, tail held in a low, tentative wave that seemed to ask permission rather than claim territory, Ethan's hand came up not to pet, but to push. The dog, about 5 years old, judging by the steady confidence of its gait and the tethered impulsiveness of youth fading into judgment, wore a red frayed collar without tags, and it nosed toward Ethan's satchel, as if scenting something urgent. "Hey, no!" Ethan snapped, standing abruptly, chair legs scraping, palm out as a block that turned into a shove of air, and then brief contact. No malice, but firm dismissal. And the dog rocked back, ears pinning for a heartbeat, before it pivoted, eyes slashing past Ethan to the curb, where a delivery van rolled too fast, music thudding behind its panels. On the cafe step, a little girl, 6, maybe 7, had just slipped free of her mother's hand to chase a blue paper windmill, skittering like a live thing, her small body a bright sketch of summer, dark bob haircut, cut straight at the chin, a lemon-yellow cardigan over a white dress dotted with tiny navy boats, pink sneakers blinking with LEDs at each hop, and in the instant that the toy flew off the curb, she forgot the rules of streets, 1 foot reaching, knee bent, face turning toward an invisible permission that wasn't there. And in that same, knife-thin slice of time, the dog launched, shoulders bunching, nails scraping. Concrete, a low boom of a bark that startled the cafe's whole front row, and Ethan flinched with everyone else as the brindle crowded the girl's space, not biting, not even mouthing, but seizing fabric with the deliberate pinch of incisors trained to pull without tearing, catching the hem of the cardigan and yanking backward with the exact physics of survival, so the child skidded on her heels, arms pinwheeling, cheeks stunned and round with air, as the van's bumper hissed across where her knees would have been, horn blaring late, driver shouting apology through a rolled-down window that offered nothing of use. The dog kept pulling until the girl's sneakers squeaked safely past the lip of the curb, and then it let go, breathing fast, eyes checking the girl with a surgeon's inventory, while the cafe exploded into voices, and the girl's mother, Grace Lin, early 30s, trim and willow tall, with a runner's long calves, tan skin warmed by sun, black hair braided and looped, a floral blouse tucked into high-waisted jeans, a practical leather crossbody slung like a bandolier, gasped and folded around her daughter. Lila, Oh my God. Hands fluttering over the cardigan, and knees and cheeks as if they were beads on a broken strand. And Ethan stood rooted in a circle of silence that existed only inside his ribcage, where shame had already landed like a swallowed stone, because he had pushed the dog away, because the dog had ignored him and saved the child anyway, because his palms remembered resistance when they should have offered help. The cafe owner, Marta Diaz, a compact woman in her late 40s with espresso brown eyes and the quick, efficient grace of someone who has carried too many trays for too many years, darted out with napkins and a bottle of water while the barista, Noah, with the forearm tattoos of vines and birds, held the door and yelled for someone to call animal control, which pricked Ethan like a thorn. "Wait," he said too loudly, pushing air through a throat that felt suddenly young and raw. "Don't call. Just give me a slip lead." And the dog looked at him with the kind of hard, luminous intelligence you only see in creatures that have worked alongside people long enough to understand both the best and the worst of us. The street recalibrated. The van was gone. Shame evaporated into the exhaust, and what remained was the cluster of witnesses whose narratives needed shape. So Ethan stepped forward with his palms open, voice wrapped in the calm cadence he used when families watched him check a pulse on linoleum floors. "She's okay. Just startled," he told Grace, and his gaze flicked to the girl. "Lila, right? You were very brave to hold still when the dog pulled," which was true in a way that mattered to a child. And Lila, small chest heaving under the lemon cardigan, nodded and buried her face in her mother's blouse for exactly 2 breaths before peeking at the brindle hero, now sitting with the dignified tension of a soldier at ease, tail thumping once with restraint every few seconds, as if reminding itself there was still protocol. Ethan knelt slowly, hand extended, not to the dog, but to the space nearby, letting his scent carry the apology before his mouth did. "Hey, buddy." And closer he saw what the adrenaline had blurred. Scars like pale threads cross-hatched on the forelegs, a callus on the right elbow from sleeping rough on concrete, pads thick and cracked at the edges, teeth clean but not polished, and the faint impression of fur having been shaved on the flank not long ago, as if for a medical procedure. He scanned the collar, no tags, but realized a tiny square of woven fabric on the inside seam carried a faded emblem, a simple outline of a hand and paw enclosed in a circle, which tumbled a memory from a training he'd once done with search and rescue volunteers. Marta returned with a slip lead improvised from twine and a rubber band, and Ethan looped it gently, the dog accepting it with a blink that looked like consent. "I'm so sorry," Grace said, tears wet and hot, her voice both formal and disheveled by adrenaline. I looked down to pay. "Thank you." And she knelt to Lila again, and then turned to the dog. "Thank you," with the crystalline sincerity of a mother who has just looked into the space where absence could have lived. Cameras had already started, because this is how the century teaches itself to remember, and the barista framed a video with the cafe sign in the background, murmuring that the city should see what stray dogs could do, which made a middle-aged man in a sports jacket mutter about liability, which made Marta click her tongue and hand him a loyalty card he hadn't earned. Ethan, who disliked attention unless it was focused on tourniquets, suggested they step inside, the shade cooler and the noises less jagged, and within minutes the brindle was stretched near his chair, with a water bowl placed like a small moon, while Lila, now recovered enough to narrate, drew the scene with a crayon on a napkin, herself with stick legs, the van comically large and frowning, and the dog a triumphant scribble with a heart-shaped nose. "He's not random," Ethan said quietly to Grace as Lila colored, and at her questioning look he explained about the emblem, about the way the dog had pulled fabric, not flesh, about how bite inhibition at that level is trained. Not luck. The door chimed, and in came Sheriff Patrick Keene, mid-50s, square-jawed, with a salt and pepper mustache, trimmed with barbershop precision, a belly that announced itself under a tan uniform, but moved with a deceptive quickness, and eyes that had seen enough small tragedies to respect the quiet heroes. He listened, reviewed Noah's video, asked soft questions at first, and then more precise ones, and when he squatted to the dog, the animal held his gaze, and then looked past him to Lila, as if needing to confirm the purpose of this conversation. "You know the emblem?" Ethan asked, standing, and the sheriff nodded slowly. "Shelter's old rescue program, the one that lost funding after the floods 2 years back. They trained a handful of dogs to assist in community emergencies. Not quite canines, more like neighborhood guardians. The emblems from Helping Hands and Paws, out on Riverside. Lot of turnover there since. Good people, stretched thin." And Grace looked at Ethan, as if to say, "You see, you were right." And Ethan's chest loosened a fraction. Yet the sheriff also warned that any incident involving an off-leash dog and a child had to be documented, even when the dog was the hero. And he mentioned an upcoming city council hearing on leash ordinances and stray management, which made Marta roll her eyes so hard they almost rattled the saucers. The dog's breathing slowed to the kind of contented rhythm that moves through a room like a calming scent, and Lila slid off her chair to sit beside him, small hand hovering in the air, until Ethan nodded permission, and then her fingers found the safe zone behind the ear and learned what trust feels like. "We should find where he belongs," Grace said, practical even through gratitude, and the dog lifted his head at belongs, with a tilt that suggested the word had many rooms. Ethan checked his watch, thought of the quiet apartment where he would otherwise eat toast over the sink, and said, "I can take him to Riverside after lunch. I know a tech there." And Keene, who had cataloged men who volunteer versus men who look away, offered to call ahead, while Marta promised free sandwiches because she believed even heroes should not conduct logistics on an empty stomach. Riverside Animal Resource Center stood on the city's south edge, beyond the green sweep of the park, a low concrete building wearing colorful murals to soften its angles. Children and animals painted mid-laugh in broad, buoyant strokes. And inside, the air held that mix of disinfectant and kibble that sharpens and blurs in alternating waves. Ethan walked in with the brindle at heel, the dog's trot settling into a companionable sync with his own stride, and at the reception desk sat someone whose smile acted like an open window. Angela Price, early 40s, 5'9", with a runner's straight posture, dark copper hair cut into a practical bob, freckles constellating over a sun-brown nose, forearms sinewed from years of lifting, kindness anchored by a spine of steel, and she wore dark jeans with a navy polo embroidered with the shelter's logo and the faint ghost of a military bearing in her efficient movements. She had served, it turned out, a decade as an Army medic before coming back to build the Helping Hands and Paws program, and when she saw the emblem on the collar, her breath hitched just one beat, because you cannot help but feel your old work reach for you from the past. The database search ladled disappointment first. No current registration, no microchip, records skimpy as a rumor, but then a note in an archived folder. Rust, brindle mix, intake from flood zone, strong pull retrieve, excels at child safety drills, placement pending with Community Guardian Initiative. And the timestamp was 18 months ago, before the funding cratered, before dogs were shuffled to overfilled fosters, before placement pending became a quiet graveyard of intentions. Angela whistled a high, private note, and the dog's ears flicked, his head turning with the attentiveness of someone who has just heard his old nickname. "Rusty," she said softly, and the dog's entire body shimmered with recognition like a cord pulled taut in the dark, and suddenly a light turns on. Lila and Grace arrived minutes later, trailed by Sheriff Keene, whose day always found reasons to bend toward decency, and while forms were signed and history reconstructed in cooperative fragments, Angela studied Ethan with the diagnostic glance of one medic to another, noting the way he asked questions to avoid the ones that aimed at himself. Later, in the training yard, she demonstrated how Rusty had been conditioned to pull children away from curbs and stairs by fabric grip, to block with his body without knocking small humans off balance, to bark in 3 counts for urgent moving vehicles, to lie down as a de-escalation cue. Lila practiced holding a foam cardigan hem, while Rusty gently tugged her across a chalk line that stood in for danger. And every adult present had to clear their throat in some inconvenient way, because the demonstration reenacted the morning's miracle in a setting that proved it wasn't a miracle at all, but the earned product of patient, loving work. Angela explained, voice catching only once when she said, "We lost the grant," that Rusty had bounced between a foster who moved away, a second who got sick, a third who couldn't keep a large dog in a rental with new rules. And in the churn, he'd slipped off the paperwork's edges like a leaf sliding into a storm drain. "He finds kids," Angela said, a quiet pride warming her tone. "He finds them when they need him." And at that, Lila hugged Rusty's neck and whispered something that belonged only to them. Grace, still steadying, asked about formal adoption, and Angela, eyes bright, discussed requirements with thorough detail. Fenced yard, commitment to continued training, volunteer hours giving back to the program. While Grace smiled regretfully because her apartment's 3rd-floor balcony opened to air, not grass, and she worked hospital shifts at odd hours, and she could promise love, but not the infrastructure Rusty deserved. Angela said it was okay, that love is never wasted, even when logistics win for a while. And Sheriff Keene, whose face could not hide its thoughts, floated an idea about the city council hearing and public demonstrations, and maybe a story that could reroute funding. As they spoke, Ethan watched Rusty settle near his boots again, with the unself-conscious assumption of proximity that is very nearly trust. And in the shade line, etched across the concrete, he felt 3 years of reflexive hardness soften, replaced by a feeling he did not yet dare to name. "You ever handled working dogs?" Angela asked, and Ethan admitted no, but that he had worked with handlers on scenes, knew how to read the triage in a dog's body, and was not afraid of learning, only of failing. Angela nodded, reading more than he said. And when paperwork and vaccinations and a fresh tag were complete, she sent them all home with a packet and an invitation to train together for the Saturday demonstration at City Hall. "Let's show them what a so-called stray can do," she said, tone as mild as a breeze, but with intention under it, like a river's current. Saturday arrived wrapped in the kind of bright blue sky that makes civic optimism feel plausible, and City Hall's steps were flanked by sycamores casting dappled shade across clusters of neighbors whose faces wore the wary hope of people who want to see proof before they write checks with their votes. On one side, a man named Rick Dalton, mid-40s, tall, in a tailored charcoal suit that advertised a donor's confidence, hair like a news anchor's, white smile, pinned like a campaign button, gathered supporters holding signs with tidy fonts. Safer streets, fewer strays, which sounded good until you read the fine print that translated to roundups and euthanasia quotas. And on the other side, Angela rolled out a portable agility ramp and a few cones while Sheriff Keene spoke to a local reporter, and Marta arrived with a cardboard dispenser of coffee and a tray of pastelitos that seemed like a policy argument made of sugar. Grace stood with Lila, both in summer dresses that fluttered lightly. Lila clutching a poster she had lettered herself. "Rusty saved me," with a crayon drawing of a dog pulling a stick figure girl back from a frowny car, and the poster's raw sincerity cut through the grown-up rhetoric with surgical accuracy. Ethan wore a soft blue t-shirt and jeans, and the expression of a man performing a public act he would rather have done in private. But he matched Angela's instructions, step for step, because discipline is just love with a calendar. And Rusty heeled beside him as if they had been partners much longer than 48 hours. Angela took the small portable mic, not grandstanding, but anchoring the event in a story, and she introduced Rusty not as a miracle, but as a student and a colleague whose tuition had been paid and then interrupted by the city's choices. She cued Ethan and Lila, and even Sheriff Keene in a choreographed demonstration. A chalk curb line, a foam van bumper on a cart, Lila holding the hem, while Rusty, on cue, performed the trained pull in slow motion. The crowd watching the principles of physics and empathy align, and when the three-bark pattern rang out clean and measured in the square, silence fell, like a sheet over the skeptics. Rick Dalton stepped forward in that way polished men do when they sense the spot that cameras like most, and he congratulated the dog, with the faintly condescending tone of a man congratulating an employee, then pivoted to warn about unpredictability, lawsuits, and the hard truth that not every dog would behave like this one, to which Angela replied, calm as math, that the solution to unpredictability is training, and the way you get training is funding. And a woman from the back shouted that her son with autism had found solace in a neighbor's rescue mutt who sat with him through storms, and a retired fireman raised his hand to say he would volunteer as a trainer if the city brought the program back. The air changed, like a room that has just realized it has more windows than it thought, and the reporter's eyebrows went up because she could smell a story pulling ahead on the night's segment. It might have ended there, a neat arc of persuasion, but the world prefers messy proof, and it sent trouble in the form of a panicked shout from the street where a toddler wobbled free from a stroller and stumbled off the curb as a cyclist, head down, barreled through the crosswalk. No one organized it. Ethan didn't think. Rusty didn't either. But they moved like a single organism. Ethan's voice cut through. "Rusty, pull!" And Rusty launched in a controlled blur, seizing the toddler's denim overalls at the thigh with perfect inhibition and hauling him backward, even as the cyclist swerved and spilled, cursing but unhurt, and the toddler blinked on his bottom, surprised at being suddenly safe. It was messy proof. Yes, there were tears and apologies and a quick check for scrapes, but there was no argument left under sunlight. That clean, Rusty had reiterated his thesis with footnotes, and Rick Dalton's smile flickered like a light that had just learned it was not the only sun. By afternoon, the council voted to restore a pilot of helping hands and paws, a small start with a large story behind it, and Angela grasped Ethan's forearm in the clasp soldiers use when a thank you needs something more than words, and Grace took Lila for ice cream, while promising Rusty would be their first volunteer appointment every Saturday morning. Ethan walked home with Rusty at his side, and the city felt subtly re-stitched, as if a seam that had frayed in him years ago had finally found thread again. He had pushed the dog away, and the dog had brought him back. Summer storms arrive like impatient houseguests in their city, and on Tuesday evening, clouds shouldered each other into a dark ceiling. The wind rearranged the park's leaves into the sound of 10,000 tiny flags, and phones buzzed with a flash flood advisory that people pretended to ignore until rain wrote the truth on their windshields. Grace was at the hospital on a double, Lila at home, with a sitter, 2 blocks from the river, and Rusty and Ethan were in Angela's training hall, working on precision downs and long-line recall when the power hiccuped and a siren far away stitched a thin line of dread through the air. The first call came not through dispatch, but through a text from Marta. Basement, flooded, kids stuck, with a pinned location 4 doors down from Grace's building. And even before Sheriff Keene's official request came through, Angela was loading the van with a harness and a rescue line, and Ethan was buckling Rusty into his car clip with hands that remembered chaos like an old song. The river had overreached its banks in the way rivers do when given permission by apathy and poor maintenance, and water licked greedily at basement doors, while the street turned from asphalt into memory of a creek. They arrived at an old feed store with a crooked sign and a rear alley that pinched tight, where a teenage sitter, soaked, shaking, mascara comets on her cheeks, kept saying, "She ran for the cat. Her mom's locket. She dropped it. The water. Please." And Rusty, hearing the frantic stair-step in the girl's voice, answered with a low sound that wasn't a bark, but the vocalization of a dog filing a plan. The building's back door was swollen shut by water, a stubborn wood mouth, and Angela's shoulder turned it into compliance, while Ethan secured the line to a pipe older than any ordinance. Inside smelled of wet concrete and grain, and the water climbed stair risers like a counting child. And somewhere beyond the dark, a small voice bounced off the geometry of fear. "Down," Ethan told Rusty, palm flattening. "And then search." And Rusty slid forward into the black water, body as quiet as an oar stroke, nostrils flaring above the line. Angela worked the headlamp and the rope payout, while Ethan counted breaths because it kept his brain from playing its oldest film, the one with the call he had failed. And Rusty vanished around a shelf, and then there was the 3-bark cadence in a lower register, an emergency variant taught for enclosed spaces, and Ethan waited with the rope, the cold gripping him like a firm hand that refused to negotiate. They found her there, Lila, waist deep on a stack of pallet wood, arms around a cat carrier lashed with shoelaces, face white and serious as an astronaut, eyes big but steady, because she had practiced staying still once in a training yard and knew the universe could be persuaded by obedience. Rusty reached her first and pressed his shoulder into her knees to steady her, then took the carrier strap in his mouth, tugging it up the ladder of crates until Angela could grab it, and Ethan lifted the girl with a joke about mermaids that landed just hard enough to give her a laugh she didn't feel forced to fake. They formed a moving knot, Rusty ahead like a compass, Ethan with Lila on his hip, Angela at their rear bracing the slow retreat, and the water argued but then stepped aside, because purpose walks differently than fear. Outside, rain battered the alley in applause, and the sitter sobbed and kissed Lila's forehead, and then apologized to Rusty as if to a person because children equip adults with better manners. When Grace arrived breathless, still in scrubs, hair escaped from its braid, eyes wet with terror, migrating into relief, she found her daughter wrapped in a blanket on Angela's lap, a cat objecting to the indignity of survival, and Rusty sitting with the gravity of a judge. There were hugs and scolds, and the kind of family council that happens in whispers. And when Grace finally rose, she looked at Ethan as if he were part of the architecture that had kept her life from collapsing. Later that night, after the water clenched and then began to loosen its grip on the city, Ethan sat on his floor, with Rusty's head in his lap, and the room's only light came from the halogen glow of a street lamp that flattened the blinds into tidy bars on the wall, and he said aloud what had been prowling the cage of his chest, "I don't want to live without you." And Rusty snorted in that amused way dogs do when they accept your confession as information to file. And the next morning Ethan filed adoption papers that felt like both a contract and a vow. They held the ceremony at the refurbished Riverside Memorial 3 weeks later, a day as clean and gold as a coin, the town's small brass band tuning on the grass, while children spun the new pinwheels that somehow never flew into the street again. The pilot program had been funded, modestly, but enough to breathe, with volunteers lined up like dominoes waiting to work, and a glass display near the park's entrance housed a shadow box of stories. Photos of rescues, letters from parents, a folded city proclamation, and at its center, a simple plaque read, "For the helpers who run toward," and under that, a paw print embedded in resin. Grace stood at the front in a floral sundress, Lila at her side, in a lemon cardigan that had been mended where Rusty had once caught it. And around them, the city arranged itself into a community again. Marta, handing out lemonade with a wink. Noah filming a highlight reel with captions for those who needed text. Sheriff Keene in dress blues that had shrunk at the dry cleaner, his mustache hyped by the sun, Angela wearing a navy blazer that somehow made her freckles look like battlefield medals, and Rick Dalton in the back, uncharacteristically quiet, as if learning that charisma and contribution are different currencies. Ethan stepped forward when Angela called his name, Rusty healing in precise joy, and he received a simple ribbon for service, which he would later hang on the same hook as his old paramedic jacket, like a reconciliation between past and present. "We tell this story because it tells us how to live," Angela said at the mic, looking not at the cameras, but at the faces that would carry the story forward. A man who pushed a dog away learned to trust again because the dog did not withhold its goodness to punish him. A mother and a child discovered that love wears many uniforms. A city remembered that safety is not the absence of risk, but the presence of training, compassion, and neighbors who step in. And a dog who once slept on concrete is going home. And the crowd made the sound people make when you hand them a truth in a shape they can hold. Then the simplest act. Grace touched Rusty's new tag, polished silver, engraved with his name and Ethan's number, while Lila clipped a small, bright ribbon to his collar with careful fingers, and Ethan, whose hands had steadied 1,000 emergencies, found them trembling now under the weight of a gentle moment. They walked afterward under trees that threw lace shadows on the path, Rusty scouting ahead with the satisfied seriousness of a guardian off duty, but never off purpose. And Ethan told Lila she could jog to the fountain as long as she stayed within the invisible boundary Rusty set with a look. And Lila demonstrated an exaggerated toe tap at the curb that made everyone laugh. Somewhere, a new delivery van slowed at a crosswalk without being told. Somewhere, a cyclist rang a bell, like an apology that had learned to be proactive. And somewhere, in the city, a door opened for a dog who would be taught to pull without biting, to bark in threes, to lie down when the temperature of a room needed cooling. Ethan and Rusty reached the fountain, and Rusty drank, then lifted his head, muzzle wet and sparkling, and looked at Ethan with that unblinking dog theology that says, "I am here because you are. We are here because we refuse to be elsewhere when it mattered." And in that look, Ethan felt the last bit of hardened glass in him melt into something clear and usable. He had once pushed the dog away, and the dog had returned with a little girl held gently by the cardigan, and without knowing it, dragged a man back to himself.